Hundreds of thousands flee south in Gaza after Israel orders evacuation. Wadi Gaza, Gaza Strip, evacuation orders from Israel's military have forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee south from their homes in northern Gaza since Friday, the largest wave of civilian displacement in a week of war with Hamas, according to the United Nations, even as others refuse to leave, fearing that escape routes are too dangerous. The main roads running north to south were crowded for a second day Saturday after the Israeli military announced a 6-hour window for civilians to move along designated streets to parts of Gaza south of the Wadi Gaza wetlands here. In some areas traffic came to a standstill with trucks, buses, overpacked cars, and people on foot all crowding on to the same narrow roads to head south. But many civilians, including hospital staff, are refusing to leave. Ahmed Okal, 43, who lives in Gaza City's Zaytown neighborhood, said he didn't trust that civilians traveling south wouldn't be targeted with airstrikes. I am definitely afraid, very afraid, but I will not risk the lives of my wife and children on the way to the south, he said, referring to reports that some of those fleeing were killed in an airstrike. Let us die inside our homes, he said. The road is dangerous. Rawan Abu Hamda, 41, also from Gaza City, started out on an evacuation route but quickly returned home after hearing reports of a strike that hit civilians on the road. She said hundreds of other families have also stayed in her neighborhood, many sheltering near Al-Shifa Hospital, in hopes the building won't be hit by airstrikes, although the ceiling of the nursery department collapsed on October 9 after shelling nearby. Reports emerged Friday of a strike on cars packed with fleeing civilians. The Washington Post verified a graphic video of the aftermath recorded along Salah al-Din Road. The video shows bodies, including several young children, strewn along the road as black smoke rises from vehicles engulfed in flames. On the north-facing side of the road, bodies are laid out amid personal belongings, including a bicycle, on flatbed trailers attached to a truck. The Palestinian Ministry of Health said 40 people injured in the attack were taken to Al-Shifa Hospital. The Israel Defense Forces are not aware of such an event at this location. We did not fire. We will not cooperate with the manipulations of Hamas, the Israeli military said in statement. The video was first geolocated by open-source researchers Chris Oziek and Gabor Friesen and confirmed by the Post. The IDF said Hamas is setting up checkpoints, preventing people from evacuating Gaza City and the north. But civilians who fled to the south since Friday told the Post they did not see any Hamas fighters in the streets. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh declared Palestinians will not leave Gaza. There is no immigration from the West Bank or from Gaza, he said in a statement on Telegram. Israel first issued the order to evacuate Gaza City and the north on Friday. More than 1 million people live in the area under the. They have time to move south, they have to start moving, Israel Defense Forces spokesman Richard Hecht said Saturday morning. We understand this will take time, he added, but declined to say how long the deadline for the evacuation, which has passed, would be extended. Israel launched a military campaign against Hamas after the group carried out unprecedented attacks on Israel October 7, killing more than 1,300 civilians and soldiers and taking more than 100 hostages. We're not going to do carpet bombing of Gaza. Every target will have intelligence behind it, Hecht said. Israeli officials have said the aim of the war in Gaza is to dismantle Hamas's military and political capabilities. Kariman Masharawi, a 27-year-old architect from Gaza City, fled south with more than 50 members of her extended family, mostly children. The first night, she said, the group slept out in the open before finding a small apartment in Rafah that everyone packed into. We had no choice, we have kids, they sent us papers that said you must move or you will be responsible for what may happen, she said, speaking to the Post through a messaging app because cell phone signals in the area were too weak to make calls. Nearly every apartment in the area is housing 20, 30 or more people, and the cramped conditions make it almost impossible to sleep, Masharawi said. My head is spinning around, she said, of the uncertainty, stress and fatigue. When we left our house, I looked at every corner and thought, will we come back here again? U.S. officials said they negotiated a temporary opening at the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt for American citizens seeking to flee, but a Palestinian Border Authority spokesman and witnesses in the area said the crossing remains closed. The evacuation orders appear to signal that Israel plans to significantly escalate its war against Hamas ahead of, or in tandem with, an expected ground invasion. But human rights groups and aid organizations are warning that civilians must continue to be protected, regardless of the orders to move out. Many persons, particularly pregnant women, children, older people and people with disabilities, will not be able to flee the area, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees said in a statement. They have no choice and must be protected at all times. Human Rights Watch said the Israeli order is not an effective warning. The roads are rubble, fuel is scarce and the main hospital is in the evacuation zone, said Clive Baldwin, a senior legal advisor at Human Rights Watch. This order does not alter Israel's obligations to never target civilians and take all measures it can to minimize harm. The Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City also received orders to evacuate by Saturday afternoon, but the Palestinian Red Crescent is refusing to shutter the facility, according to a statement from the group. The hospital is providing care to a large number of patients, including children in incubators and people in the intensive care unit, the Red Crescent said in a statement. The group said tens of thousands of civilians remain in the area and hundreds of people are also sheltering at or near the hospital. Red Crescent teams at the hospital will continue to provide essential life-saving services to the people remaining, and the organization will continue the provision of services to the sick and wounded. More than 2,000 people in Gaza have been killed, including 724 children and more than 8,700 have been wounded since clashes began October 7, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is fast becoming untenable, the UN relief head warned Saturday. Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths described the last week as one of utter anguish and devastation, but cautioned that he fears the worst is yet to come. With the conflict entering its second week, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees said that 2 million people in Gaza are now at risk of running out of water. It has become a matter of life and death, the agency said in a statement Saturday. We need to truck fuel into Gaza now. Fuel is the only way for people to have safe drinking water. If not, people will start dying of severe dehydration, among them young children, said agency head Philippe Lazzarini, calling for an end to Israel's siege of Gaza. George reported from Jerusalem and Brown reported from Washington. Joyce Lee and Samuel Oakford in Washington contributed to this report. A flood of misinformation shapes views of Israel-Gaza conflict. The barrage of false images, memes, videos, and posts, mostly generated from within the region itself, is making it difficult to assess what is real. A WhatsApp voice memo purporting to have insider information ricocheted across hundreds of group chats in Israel early on Monday. The Israeli army was planning for another battle like we've never experienced before, the anonymous woman said in Hebrew, warning that people should prepare to lose access to food, water, and internet service for a week. Across the country, Israelis raced to the banks and to the grocery stores, anticipating another attack. But the message, the army clarified hours later on X, turned out to be a falsehood. 1 week into the war between Israel and Gaza, social media is inducing a fog of war surpassing previous clashes in the region, one that's shaping how panicked citizens and a global public view the conflict. Social media has long played a critical role in battles in the area. During the 11-day war between Israel and Hamas in 2021, posts of carnage in Gaza rallied the public to the Palestinian cause. Researchers say increased internet access and the spread of smartphones enabled a watershed moment, revealing how tech platforms could show the horror and human toll of such events. But now, a volatile, months-long fight over Israel's democratic future has primed conspiracies and false information to spread within its borders. Tech platforms, diminished from waves of layoffs, have receded from policing falsehoods, disinformation, and hate speech online. Electricity outages and strikes on telecommunications infrastructure in Gaza threaten Palestinians' connectivity, according to human rights organizations. I'm terrified, Marwa Fatafta, a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, a Palestinian think tank and regional policy manager for the nonprofit digital human rights group Access Now. There's a lot of information being shared that is not verified, a lot of calls to violence and dehumanization. And all this is fanning the flames for further massacres of Palestinians. Foreign disinformation, a key element of Russia's global strategy, has been a major feature of the protracted war in Ukraine. But in the current Middle East war, researchers have so far found only minimal evidence of disinformation originating abroad, said John Hultquist, chief analyst with the Google-owned cybersecurity firm Mandiant. Instead, much misinformation about the war is directed inward. Posts, videos, and memes falsely claim that the attack stemmed from collusion between Hamas and Israel. In the 24 hours after the Hamas attack, the hashtag Traitors from Within became the top trend on X, formerly Twitter, in Hebrew. Some threads posited that Palestinian citizen of Israel workers were stationed at the border fence, while others claimed the attack was orchestrated to push a peace deal with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Months of protests over the country's future, deep domestic polarization and broad distrust of authorities have caused these theories to spread, said Achia Schatz, director of Fake Reporter, an Israeli watchdog organization dedicated to fighting disinformation and hate speech online. One viral TikTok video featured a woman who identified herself as a former soldier on the Gaza Strip. She claimed that the border was so tightly controlled that even a cockroach would have been detected in advance, a description many commenters took to mean that Israel would have had to have aided Hamas in penetrating it. Supporters of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have taken to calling critics of his far-right government traitors in recent months, said Schatz. Now the narrative is bleeding into the current conflict. People don't want to believe that their leader has failed them, he said. So it must have been an inside job. Hamas and its supporters have taken advantage of Israel's disunity. On Monday, a pro-Hamas account called Gaza now shared an image suggesting that former left-wing Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was fleeing the country. The image was undated and showed him in the baggage claim at an airport. The Gaza Now account had picked it up from a Jewish Israeli influencer who supports the far-right government of Netanyahu, and had shared the content to criticize Israel's left. The influencer ultimately issued an apology on X. 2 years ago, when a war broke out between Israel and Hamas, locals used their cell phones to broadcast a play-by-play of the demonstrations and subsequent bombardment to the world. But the stakes are far higher in today's conflict, said Fatafta. While the 2021 conflict resulted in 250 deaths in Gaza and 13 in Israel, at least 1,300 people in Israel and more than 1,799 people in Gaza have been killed in the current war. And unlike in 2021, Palestinians in Gaza are already losing access to the internet, she said, compromising their ability to tell their story to the world. People don't have enough electricity to charge up their devices, she said. There are people who can't send SMS messages, some telecommunications infrastructure has been damaged. It's becoming an information blackout. Hamas' swift and violent attack is more difficult to parse than the events in 2021. No one knows what really happened on the border, Schatz said. It was too big, too fast and too brutal. This void is being filled by misinformation that appeals to people's rage, which researchers warn could lead to more anti-Semitic attacks or violence against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and to justify a more brutal retaliation in Gaza. Another WhatsApp voice memo featured the voice of a man claiming to be a soldier with intelligence that the country's Arab citizens, roughly 20% of Israel's population, were planning a coordinated attack. The audio message, which was played for the Washington Post, said Palestinian citizens were going to show up in vehicles with Israeli plates and start shooting people. WhatsApp, a Meta-owned messaging platform, is the default communication across the region and enables people to forward audio messages to many groups, each of which can include more than 1,000 members. But the source of such messages, and the extent of their spread, is nearly impossible to trace. A Palestinian digital rights organization called 7amla says it has detected more than 19,000 cases of hate speech and violent incitement against Palestinians in the Hebrew language on X since October 7, the first day of escalations. The organization's executive director, Nadim Nashif, said he wasn't able to flag the content to X because the organization's former points of contact at the company had been fired by Elon Musk, who has dramatically shrunk the company's workforce since he took ownership last year. One such story is an allegation that Hamas beheaded babies in Kfar Aza, a kibbutz near Israel's southern border with Gaza. The unconfirmed story appears to stem from a single Israeli news report on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the Israeli Prime Minister's office appeared to validate the report, with a spokesperson saying the babies were found with their heads decapitated. The claim went viral, spreading across newspapers, social media platforms, and a CNN broadcast. President Biden appeared to advance the story in a meeting with Jewish community leaders. "I have been doing this a long time. I never really thought that I would have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children," he said. An administration official later clarified Biden's remarks, saying that Biden was referring to public statements from officials and media reports and had not actually seen the photos. Less than a day later, the Israeli government backtracked. There have been cases of Hamas militants carrying out beheadings and other ISIS-style atrocities, according to a Thursday statement provided to CNN. However, we cannot confirm if the victims were men or women, soldiers or civilians, adults or children. To combat disinformation, Fake Reporter is running a war room staffed with 2,500 volunteers across Israel. The volunteers flag and report suspicious, malicious, and graphic content to the platforms themselves, and Fake Reporter also debunks misleading narratives on social media. But over the last year, tech companies' abilities to field these complaints has been compromised by waves of layoffs in units responsible for policing problematic content. Meta, which owns Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp, has laid off many members of a global operations team that monitors the platform, including Arabic speakers, according to a person familiar with the layoffs who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe them. Under the leadership of Musk, X has fired the teams that acted as point people on the ground for advocates in the region. On Wednesday, the European Union announced a probe into X for failures to moderate potentially illegal content and disinformation on its service. Schatz said there is little communication from Meta-owned WhatsApp because the messaging platform is viewed as a private, encrypted service. And at X, he echoed Nashif's account that, over the last year, there has been no one to talk to due to the firings. He said the company had reached out for the first time this week. Mandiant Hultquist said that in comparison to the cacophony at the local level, foreign disinformation is, so far, playing a small role. He said that his team had detected fake accounts tied to Iran, whose leader has repeatedly called for the annihilation of Israel, posing as Egyptians across all social media platforms to celebrate Israel's humiliation. But Eric Feinberg, vice president for content moderation at the Coalition for a Safer Web, noted that Hamas and its supporters have been able to use X to share anti-Semitic propaganda across the Arab world relatively unchecked. He provided screenshots of pro-Hamas accounts using WhatsApp and X in English to rally support for the organization's attacks on Israel in Pakistan. "Right now," said Hultquist, "it's very difficult for a layperson to get to ground truth." Joseph Menn contributed to this report. Americans remain stuck in Gaza as U.S. evacuation deal falters. Before dawn on Saturday, Abood Okal and his family received the news they had desperately been waiting for. Okal and his wife and their 1-year-old son were finally offered a possible way out of Gaza and back to their home near Boston. An email from the U.S. State Department told them the sole border crossing with Egypt may be opened for a 5-hour window later that day, from noon to 5 p.m. "If you wish to leave Gaza, you may want to take advantage of this opportunity," the message said. On Saturday morning, Okal and his family went to the Rafah crossing only to find it closed. There were no officials on the Palestinian side of the crossing except for a few plainclothes security guards whose job was to keep people from getting too close to the gate, Okal said. The U.S. government had negotiated a deal to allow American citizens to leave Gaza and cross into Egypt during the 5-hour window, U.S. officials said Saturday. But Palestinian and Egyptian officials failed to communicate about opening it, an official at the border said. By the end of the day, no one had been able to cross. Wael Abu Omar, the Palestinian spokesman for the Rafah crossing, said Palestinian officials had not had any communication with their counterparts on the Egyptian side. Egyptian media outlets reported that Cairo would only allow foreigners to cross the border if aid shipments could be delivered to Gaza. Israel, meanwhile, has said it would strike any trucks coming across the border, especially trucks carrying fuel, according to a diplomatic official who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity because the official was not authorized to discuss sensitive negotiations. Officials are discussing the possibility of setting up a screening mechanism that would allow the Israelis to inspect goods in each vehicle entering Gaza, the diplomat said. Another official familiar with the talks over the aid deliveries said any agreement would require Israel to stop bombing the enclave for a few hours. The confusion and uncertainty surrounding the Rafah crossing comes as hundreds of thousands of people have fled their homes in northern Gaza in response to an evacuation order from Israel's military, ahead of a possible ground invasion into the besieged enclave. An estimated 500 to 600 Palestinian Americans, like the Okal family, are in Gaza. With no way out, families have pleaded for help from U.S. officials. In a statement, a State Department spokesperson said the U.S. government is working to secure the safe exit of U.S. citizens from Gaza. We have informed U.S. citizens in Gaza with whom we are in contact that if they assess it to be safe, they may wish to move closer to the Rafah border crossing, the spokesperson said, adding that there may be very little notice if the crossing opens and it may only open for a limited time. President Biden, in a call Saturday with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, discussed coordination with the United Nations, Egypt, Jordan, Israel and others in the region to ensure innocent civilians have access to water, food, and medical care, according to a readout from the call. U.S. officials have spent the past several days trying to evacuate all U.S. staff in Gaza, a group of about 15 Palestinians that includes 3 U.S. government employees who work for USAID in Gaza, along with their immediate family members, according to a diplomatic official familiar with the situation. Each time, they've been stopped at checkpoints near the border inside Gaza and have been unable to leave. In some cases at these checkpoints, the diplomatic official said, people identifying themselves as Hamas have said none of them will be able to leave until aid trucks enter the Gaza Strip. Canadian officials also told citizens on Friday that the Rafah crossing might open Saturday for a 5-hour window to allow Canadians to exit. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly told reporters Saturday that the latest information she had was that violence in the area forced authorities to cancel the operation. She did not elaborate. On Friday, Okal and his extended family had rushed south from Jabalia in the north of Gaza after the Israeli army ordered more than 1 million people to evacuate. They scrambled frantically to find cars to fit them all and a place to stay near the crossing. Okal, 36, and his family spent hours waiting under the hot sun Saturday. He said there were several hundred people there, including another American family from New Jersey. He said there were other foreign nationals too, including Canadians, Swedes, Spaniards, and Norwegians. As the day dragged on, his wife, Wafa Abizadeh, took their exhausted toddler, Youssef, back to the home where they are staying with 30 other people, a short drive away. Food vendors near the crossing warned Okal that it was not safe to stay once the sun set. Still, he remained there until nearly 6 p.m., he said, hoping something might change. When he began to hear the sound of fighter planes and drones, he knew he had to leave the area. Karim Fahim in Beirut, John Hudson in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and Amanda Coletta in Toronto contributed to this report. Politicians called them traitors. Now they're manning Israel's home front. Byington, Israel. It was just last month when Aaron Navon, a former Israeli combat soldier, was arrested at an anti-government demonstration near his home outside of Tel Aviv. He was one of millions of Israelis, including active and former reservists, who spent the year protesting the far-right government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israeli politicians denounced protesters like Navon, calling them anarchists and traitors. But now, 53-year-old Navon and other veterans who have been critical of the government are mobilizing to assist Israel's war effort in Gaza. They put politics aside and are helping in the mass evacuation of Israeli civilians from communities near the Gaza perimeter, as Israel steps up a military campaign that has displaced nearly 1 million people and killed more than 2,200, according to Palestinian health officials. We're not coming for political reasons, said Sefi Areli, a former seaman in the Israeli Navy who has been leading civilian evacuations from the southern city of Sderot, about 8 miles from Gaza. Both Areli and Navon are members of the Sprawling Brothers and Sisters in Arms Protest Group, an association of active reservists and military veterans who came together to oppose the policies of Netanyahu's government, and who are now among the leaders of the grassroots mobilization networks at the front. We come because we've developed an infrastructure, Areli said from the group's makeshift headquarters in Byington, a sleepy kibbutz in the Negev desert. And we have teams that are simply ready to work. Indeed, Navon said he jumped into gear immediately on the morning of October 7, when Hamas militants based in Gaza began a large-scale incursion into southern Israel, first attacking military bases and then gunning down civilians at a music festival and in their homes in local farming communities. The brutal assault killed at least 1,300 people, taking the country's government and military by surprise. Much of Israel's military resources had been directed to the occupied West Bank, where the right-wing government sought to root out Palestinian militants and protect the Israeli settlements that the land Palestinians envision as part of a future state. The Israel Defense Forces began to mobilize troops on October 7, but without trains or buses available to transfer them to the south. So Navon and his fellow volunteers with brothers and sisters in arms tapped into their networks to organize cars and drive soldiers from across the country down to their bases. Thousands more brothers in arms members connected with each other as the horrors unfolded, using the WhatsApp messaging groups they created to coordinate action during the protests. The army then gave the ex-reservists the green light to expand their efforts and enter active military zones to rescue civilians along the border. They set off for southern Israel en masse and set up a makeshift command post in Byington, roughly 15 miles east of Gaza. "We are the kind of people who do things," said Navon, who has carried out hundreds of evacuations since October 8. In Byington, teams of psychologists and enormous trays of home-cooked food await the evacuated families, many of whom hid in their homes as Hamas gunmen rampaged outside, killing neighbors and their own loved ones. On shaded patches of grass, Israeli commanders briefed the evacuation teams, reminding them of the risks as rockets fly into Israel from Gaza and militants continue to try to infiltrate the border. If volunteers are caught in the crossfire between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian fighters, they should do their best to stay out of the way, the commanders said. "Your mission is not to bring back corpses of terrorists," one commander, Avner, said as he instructed 3 separate teams before they set out on their respective missions. Areli said that the volunteers also encounter hostile Israeli residents, some of whom have hurled verbal abuse at the ex-reservists as militants continued to sneak into communities and rocket fire from Gaza intensified. In Sderot, where Hamas militants overran local security forces and laid siege to the police station, some residents have expressed their gratitude for the rescue workers. But others have shouted, "This is all because of you," Areli said. Sderot is a traditional stronghold for Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party, and Areli's volunteers have tried to explain that they are there as Israelis, not as leftist protesters, he said. Many of the volunteers believe that Netanyahu's coalition ignored the mounting threats coming from the Gaza Strip. "The decisions they made were insane and we've seen the tragedy that they have led to," said Navon. "But those politicians are irrelevant to us now," he said. "We who are physically out in the field are already building a new future for our country." Eldad Miller helped evacuate civilians from Sderot over the past week, and said that the trauma Israelis suffered means that many residents are still struggling to communicate with their rescuers. Miller said that on Tuesday, he drove members of a Sderot family who had been hiding in the dark, the windows covered with blankets, for days, as Hamas militants banged at their door. The teenage son rotated shifts, with his father standing at the front door with a kitchen knife. When Miller picked the family up, they were silent, he said. "There's no more trust left," Miller said, adding that he thought the government's poor response was as much a result of internal division as it was severe intelligence failures. "After this is over, there will be investigations into the people who called us traitors. That's not interesting for us," he said. "What we know, now, is that our country needs us." Tim Craig and Aaron Gregg. U.S. institutions under fire for their support, or silence, on Israel. It might seem like a safe move, condemn violence on both sides of the conflict in Israel and express support for Jews and Palestinians alike because of the losses they've suffered. But in a moment this heavy with emotion and rage, few moves are safe. U.S. companies, politicians, universities and school districts who took that approach found themselves under fire from Jewish groups and others for appearing to downplay what began this crisis a week ago, a militant attack by Hamas on Israel that killed hundreds of civilians. Jewish parents in the suburbs of Boston, Washington and elsewhere protested after their school leaders put out statements that sought a measure of neutrality. Senator Edward J. Markey, D.Mass., appearing at a vigil in Boston, was booed when he called for de-escalation of the current violence. And at Stanford University, faculty protested after university leaders wrote to students about the devastating crisis in Israel and Palestine without calling out Hamas as the aggressor. After a series of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic messages and incidents spread across campus, Stanford's president and provost sent a lengthy letter describing some of them and referring to horrifying new details about the Hamas attack in Israel last weekend, which involved intolerable atrocities including murder of civilians and kidnapping. This was the dynamic in the initial days of fighting, as bodies of Israelis of all ages were found and stories of hostage-taking spread fear and anger. What's unknown is how the mood might shift as Israel forces continue laying siege to Gaza, cutting off all water and electricity, and then launch a full-scale counteroffensive, which could mean enormous civilian casualties among Palestinians who have nowhere to flee. Figuring out what to say has gripped college campuses in particular. Conflict in the Middle East has for decades fueled student and faculty activism and divided academic communities. At Harvard University, for instance, the student organizations that make up the Harvard College Palestine Solidarity Committee issued a statement in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack saying the Israeli regime is entirely responsible for all the unfolding violence. That prompted a rebuke from former Harvard president Larry H. Summers, who said on X, formerly Twitter, that he was sickened by the university's silence. Administrators then issued a statement, expressing hope that Harvard could modulate rather than amplify the deep-seated divisions. Several leaders of the Harvard Divinity School urged a reframing of the events to look not just at the Hamas attack but at decades of oppression on the part of Israel. Those sentiments, in turn, prompted a critical open letter response from dozens of faculty members. After that came yet another statement, this time from Harvard President Claudine Gay, condemning Hamas's actions as terrorist atrocities. Corporate leaders, too, have struggled to walk an appropriate line between acknowledging a traumatic moment and weighing the very real business risks of saying the wrong thing. Their dilemma is familiar. In 2020, after the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer sparked nationwide protests, some chief executives issued statements that failed to capture the moment while others faced employee anger for saying nothing. Since then, companies such as Disney, Target and Anheuser-Busch have been swept up in the nation's cultural and political battles. This week, many proceeded gingerly. The chipmaker Intel, which counts more than 11,700 employees at 5 facilities in Israel, told Reuters it was closely monitoring the situation there and taking steps to safeguard and support our workers. Microsoft condemned the hatred and brutality and pointed to acts of terrorism without naming Hamas. A statement from Chief Human Resources Officer Kathleen Hogan expressed sympathy for Israelis who have been killed, injured or lost loved ones, and said the company's main focus was the safety of its nearly 3,000 workers there. It also addressed Microsoft's Jewish and Palestinian employees globally, noting the fears and concerns that each group is feeling. At Starbucks, the dispute was between the corporation and some employees. In now-deleted social media posts, a faction calling itself Starbucks Workers United expressed solidarity with Palestine. After a backlash from conservative media outlets, Starbucks issued its own statement that the company unequivocally condemns acts of terrorism, hate and violence. It added, Workers United's words and actions belong to them and them alone. Other business leaders were more overtly pro-Israel, including Bill Ackman, an outspoken hedge fund manager whose philanthropic work has included Jewish causes. He lashed out against the Harvard students behind the anti-Israel statement and said several chief executives wanted to know the identities of those involved so as to ensure that none of us inadvertently hire any of their members. Political groups also risked alienating even strong supporters. In the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack, the Democratic Socialists of America expressed solidarity with Palestine and wrote on Instagram, "Today's events are the direct result of Israel's apartheid regime." That infuriated comedian Sarah Silverman, who said she had been a lifetime member. She unleashed a profanity-filled tirade that excoriated the organization for failing to understand the violence perpetrated on Israelis by Hamas. Some school districts learned the same lesson about how hard, or perhaps impossible, it is to get their message right. In Montgomery County, MD, which has the state's largest school system, Superintendent Monica B. McKnight wrote families midweek to warn parents about upsetting videos and images from the attacks that were circulating on social media. She noted that many in the community were experiencing fear, anxiety, and grief. Jewish groups responded that this was both overdue and inadequate, saying several area school districts had fallen short but directing particular anger at Montgomery. Our school system's refusal to honestly name the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust is infuriating and disheartening to our entire community, the D.C. branches of the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Anti-Defamation League declared. The pushback came in the opposite direction in Northern Virginia after school board meetings in Arlington County, where the superintendent opened the session by expressing support for the Jewish community, and Fairfax County, where the board took a moment of silence to honor the victims, their loved ones, and the entire Jewish community who are suffering from Saturday's vicious terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel. In Arlington, Shema Al-Hanoudi asked during a public comment period why the district was not recognizing Palestinians. I heard your remarks about the safety of our Jewish students. Can we expect to hear similar comments extended to your Muslim and Palestinian families and staff? And in Fairfax, school board member Abrar Omish asked why we buy into a rhetoric that negates not only the humaneness of Palestinians, but justifies the indiscriminate retaliation against the population. Experts in corporate communications offer mixed advice. Some say the smartest move is to say nothing. Vikas Mittal, a professor of management and marketing at Rice University, cautions against statements that appear to take a side or justify actions as right or wrong. Given the horror of Hamas's attack on Israel, he would have counseled companies to say nothing or to speak up only after days of careful deliberation. Statements today travel far and wide thanks to social media, he noted, making responses all that much riskier. A lot of corporate communications departments will say, we condemn that or we condemn this, rather than listening and understanding and then commenting on something, he said. Others recommend bolder steps. Sandy Lish, co-founder of the Boston-based Castle Group, which provides crisis management advice to colleges and universities as well as K-12 private schools, said she is telling clients to clearly identify Hamas as the aggressor and Israelis as the victims. It's not that Palestinian lives do not matter, she stressed, it's that this is a time for condemning the assault for what it was. This is a terrorist attack on innocent Jewish people, she said. That's what the schools should be saying. That's what happened. Karina Elwood, Nicole Asbury, and Jack Stripling contributed to this report.